Thanks, Kerry. Being a technical man, I've got the wonderful technology, but look, to all my former parliamentary colleagues, good to see you here. I can tell you life after that job improved significantly. Look, folks, this review of the Local Government Act presents us with a very rare chance. We get to redesign local government for the next 30 or 40 years, and to be blunt, and I'm sometimes accused of doing that, I don't think this is yet fully sunk in. And the first question that we've got to deal with is, does local government need redesigning? And I think that's a self-evident and resounding yes. I don't think there's anybody arguing no change. While every council's different, I argue that the local government system's dysfunctional and expensive. It's the least accountable level of government in the nation, and it's lacking most of the regulatory, political and public oversight measures of every other level of government. But even if you disagree with everything that I've said and submitted and everything that I'm going to say tonight, I'm prepared to bet that none of you are advocating that the current dated, and it is dated, and quite prescriptive Act is the best we can do. Which brings us to the second question that we should all be focusing on, in my view, and that is, how should the Act be redesigned? Now, I'd like to start first with a strange thing. It's called democracy. There are people who still struggle with the concept, but it's been around in various forms for a couple of thousand years. It's a system where citizens have a right to have a say in how they're governed, and those people with powers cede the citizens the right to vote their representatives into, and a lot of our elected representatives lose sight of this, they get to vote you out of office also. It's not anarchy, it's messy, and it requires compromise. But as a nation, we've been to war a number of times to fight for democracy, and I have a very strong view that we should give it a bit of a chance in local government. When Abraham Lincoln delivered his famous address in Gettysburg, Pennsylvania on the 19th of November 1863, he finished with this statement: that this nation under God shall have a new birth of freedom, and that people, the government of the people, by the people, for the people, shall not perish from the earth. And I can tell you that is truly one of the world's most brilliant speeches, except for one thing. He pinched it. He plagiarised it. It's not an Abraham Lincoln original. The first recorded quote that we've been able to find from it is from a bloke who was Lord Byron's best man. He was quite an interesting chap in his own name. His name was Sir John Hobhouse. And 44 years before Abraham Lincoln, on the 16th of February 1819, Hobhouse said, "I'm a man chosen for the people, by the people, and if elected I will do no other business than that of the people." Now, the reason I go back to Sir John's comment is because it was made in our colonising power a decade before the Swan River colony was settled. And the point I'd like you to all take on board and to get everywhere you go is that it's not a shock in Western Australia that we have democracy. The concept has been around in our system of government before we had a system of government in this state. Those of you who are elected officials will have worked out by now that public life is hard, and it is hard. It's difficult. If it was as easy as my old colleagues in the media make it out to be, they'd all be doing it. They're not. They write about it or put it on telly. There are always people in local government who are in it for the wrong, or in every level of government, to be honest, who are in it for their own ends, but overwhelmingly it's public service that drives people into public life. It's the desire to want to make things better. So it's no surprise to find that local government is jam-packed with good people. I don't have to agree with them all to know that there are good people right through our system of local government. But they are all battling the dysfunction caused by a deficient piece of legislation. They have to deal with poor regulation policies and processes. And I argue, and my first submission and my second submission will argue this strongly, and I'll be doing it again tonight. This review process demonstrates that dysfunction crystal clear manner. Glad you're here, Duncan. I'm not sure you're going to enjoy it, but I'm really glad you're here.
Do I get a rise in return?
Oh, don't start me. Don't start me. No, you have. Look, we're in a sector dominated by what I call the club, and the club consists of the Department of Local Government, the WA Local Governments Association, and the local government professionals. I've forgotten their full title. And what we find is we're finding that that club is reviewing itself, and the three key members are an integral part of the review. There are other sectional interests involved in the review group, but the domination of the process by the club poses the question of who is speaking for and protecting the public interest. And I think that's really the biggest question. It's a flawed process, in my view. My view, for those who are interested, is I always think strong parliamentary committees are better at doing this sort of work than almost anything else, to be blunt. And while I'm speaking of parliaments and parliamentarians, there are many, many trite political points that can be made through this process, and I encourage all sides of politics to ignore them. There really are, in this local government scene, there really are so many major issues that you can all get brownie points advocating for the things that matter and ignore the petty politics. And I can also tell you there are no votes in the petty politics. The votes lie in this matter on avoiding the theatre of petty party politics and getting into the grown-up game and dealing with the stuff that matters. And folks, this review matters. And I stress that. This is one of the major points I'd like to hammer home to people. This review actually matters. These big laws are usually only given this type of overhaul a couple of times a century. 2 or 3 times a century is when these laws get overhauled. Reading through the submissions, and I've been through all the major ones and a number of others, very few of the submissions, if any, have proposed any new direction for local government. I've described most of them as mundane minimalism. Most of the submissions offer more of the same, with relatively minor changes to some of the favourite hobby horses of those particular groups, individuals. My view is that for such a major review of such an important piece of legislation, that is a terrible response. I just want to divert, if I can. Well, I can because I'm speaking, I guess, Kerry, unless you knock me around. But I just want to quickly address an important side issue. We should be pushing as hard as we possibly can to have the public and elected councillors involved in the review committees and the review processes of this review. And we need to do that to positively counter the influence of the key protagonists of WALGA and the local government professionals. Both WALGA and the professional officers' constitutions require them to act in their own interests. They are not able to act in the public interest. I call them self-serving bodies. That may be a bit gratuitous, but I still mean it. They are self-serving bodies and they're an integral part of the review process. But even holding that position of privilege, they've still both taken another bite and made submissions into the process that they are an integral part of reviewing. So I took it upon myself to read, examine and analyse their submissions, and I've assessed their recommendations under 6 categories. Those that remove or reduce democracy, those that remove or reduce oversight, those that make matters more convenient for administrators, and those that expand the administrator's role, amalgamation avoidance that is not covered by the first point, which was removing or reducing democracy, or just simply none of the above. They don't fit any of those categories. Then I invented a thing that I call the vested interest factor. and the vested interest factor is points 1 through to 4. For Walga, 81% of their recommended actions either benefit administrators, disadvantage the public interest, or both. For the professional officers, their vested interest factor sits at 68%. Of their recommended actions, 68% of their recommended actions either benefit administrators or disadvantage the public interest, or both. Now, I concede that's a subjective process, but I also suggest to you that it's better than no analysis at all, and that's what we've had up until tonight. But the direction it highlights is deeply concerning. It is neither fair nor desirable that both of these powerful groups sit on the reference group and that all that they submit then goes back to them for consideration. More so will you consider what they're recommending. No member of the public or no elected official gets those same 2 bites. Which brings us to the department. And therein lies another major problem with this review. It's impossible for a department to critically analyse its own performance or to objectively assess the laws they work under. They're a government department and they have no power to do other than that authorised by their Act or their minister. And we know from the spate of recent royal commissions and inquiries, there's been Katanning in WA, there's one chaired by a very good bloke I know into Whitnum. We've had the child abuse state and federal, and in a number of states and federal. We've just had the banking royal commission, and in this state the daddy of all the inquiries was the WA Inc Royal Commission, which was probably the most competent and thorough examination of a system of government that's ever been done in this country. And what we've learnt from every one of those studies is that the club reviewing the club always fails. It always fails. There are no exceptions. We know it doesn't work. And we know it doesn't work because there is a clear and unacceptable conflict of interest between a body holding all the roles of administrator, regulator and reviewer. In effect, they are the accused, the judge and the jury. It's just not right. Moving back to the central matters, one of the inbuilt conflicts in local government is between the elected and the unelected. And the wording often used is the separation of powers. Now, that particular phrase has a special meaning in Westminster-style democracies. It means the separation of the Parliament, the executive and the judiciary, and it's integral to our system of representative government. It is not a separation of powers between a council and their administration. Although they both have different roles and different functions, they are not equals. There's no doubt that councils exist to govern. They can delegate some of their powers. They have significant oversight powers under the Act, more than most people are aware of, to be blunt. And there's no doubt the CEO is their employee. And while those two relationships are very poorly defined, they are not equal. Liberal Minister Paul Omadai was the last minister to conduct a comprehensive review of the Act. Now, I've got to say some things about Paul. He had some redeeming features. He barracked for East Perth, so that put him in the good box for me. But apart from that, Paul was a competent bloke. He was a good bloke. He had some serious experience in local government and he had some serious parliamentary experience. He had good people around him and he had the right intentions. And I know that because, as some of my colleagues know, you sometimes sit around in the back when all these things are going on and have chats. And I know where Paul was coming from. And the big nut he wanted to crack was councillors interfering in the daily tasks of council. Now, I won't spend a lot of time about it, but it was a genuine problem and it was debilitating. Councillors were going to people in the organisation and saying, stop doing that, do that, I'm a councillor, do as you're told. It was endemic. He fixed it. There's absolutely no doubt about that. He fixed the problem. But in doing so, he created a two-headed monster, the CEO and the Independent Republic of Administration. A good CEO, you all know this, a good CEO is priceless. You would also know that it's not the system that makes good CEOs do good work. It's the good CEOs. They use their intelligence, their experience and their talent to make things work, and they do it despite the system. Unscrupulous CEOs manipulate councillors, play favourites, selectively brief sycophants. All right, end the list. And look, I'm now an old man, and I'm now an old man, and I can tell you that domineering CEOs can destroy councillors, and they can destroy individuals. But put the individual thing to one side for a minute. More importantly, they destroy councils, and I can tell you those councils stay destroyed for a long time. It takes years for the community to get over those problems and rebuild. Well, the current Act creates the CEO as the source of advice and information to council, the hire and fire of staff, the compiler of budgets, believe it or not, the returning officer in elections, if that's the arbiter on what does or does not come before council, and the determiner and policer of standards and complaints. Now, that's not an exhaustive list, but the legislated role gives to council CEOs creates a central, powerful mandarin, and it's a public position unlike any other. My phone, since my submission went in, my phone's been in meltdown, and I've had tales from everywhere of threats, officious, vindictive behaviour and downright corruption. And I'll come back to corruption very quickly, but I just want to make this point. I don't want to be the focus for dissidents and malcontents and all of those things. If you've got problems, I'm probably not the bloke to come to because I'm not going to help you. I'm about the system, not the individual issues in individual councils, except for 2J, where I reserve... No, we won't go there. But I want to draw your attention to the CCC and the report they brought down on Exmouth, and just remind you of some of the key points of that again. They said, importantly, the report spotlights the failure of a council to exercise oversight on its CEO. And they said, and areas worthy of assessment and focus by all local governments include inadequate governance, whether due to placing friendship above probity, ignorance of robust procedures, or some other reason. A culture of entitlement, or a lack of adherence to local government policy and inadequate oversight. The CCC, or CCC, also said a previous report had also focused on a CEO who failed the ratepayers of the town and exposed breathtaking ignorance of the role and responsibilities of councillors. My friends, Welga dismissed that critical warning from the state's primary corruption watchdog the day after it was issued, which is more than passing strange because that year the CCC's annual report came down, and when you go through and crunch the numbers, it shows that local government constitutes 13% of what I'd loosely call the public service, but it contributes 32% of the public sector allegations made to the CCC. Clearly, all is not good in the sector, and something needs to change. And let me nail the point again, this legislative review is the vehicle for the change. And it deserves a lot of attention to be paid to it, because not only are these reviews so rare and influential, sometimes, or not sometimes, quite often changes that are made go places where you don't expect they're going to go. Even well-written laws can have unanticipated consequences. And I know for certain Paul Omadai didn't intend to create the monster he did, but I also excuse him from it because it's not all his own work. Since he changed the legislation, Welga and the Professionals Officers Association have worked diligently to extend the scope of CEO's authority. And as I outlined earlier, in this review, that push continues to try and minimise oversight on CEOs and reduce democratic input. I don't think the public want a system where administrative power exceeds elected power. I don't think we want that. The local government system in WA is way out of balance and it needs correcting, which brings me back to the second question I asked at the outset, and that is, how should the system be redesigned? And my answer to that has four major components. They come under these headings: democracy, boundaries, planning and power. I expand on them a bit in my coming submission to round two, but I'll touch on them briefly here. Democracy. Simply put, the system has to recognise and prioritise elected office over administrative office. The primacy of the elected person is paramount in a democracy. There are some relatively simple solutions that would improve democratic outcomes. They're not easy, but they're simple, and they will work. And they are compulsory optional preferential voting, which I concede has already been recommended. And the second thing is that every one of these processes that's being looked at legislatively needs to be reviewed to make sure that it optimises the democratic processes in local government. Then we get to boundaries. Boundaries are controversial. They shouldn't be, but they are. And I can tell you, in this nation, since Queensland's Joh Bjelke-Petersen days, no other level of government has retained the right to determine the boundaries. Independent bodies set electoral boundaries in every other jurisdiction, and there is no plausible reason why local government should be any different. Question is, where do you set the boundaries? And that's where it gets messy. In my mind, there's an obvious basis for forming local government boundaries. It is purely obvious. It's a definable community of interest. If you don't have a definable community of interest, it isn't a local government. Why have you got it? There are also some obviously lesser contributing factors, such as physical barriers, features, economic factors, community culture, location, adjoining boundaries, all of those sorts of things. I mean, you don't put Bunbury and Kununurra in the same council because it suits you. There's got to be some contiguity, I guess I'd call it. And in my mind, it's a no-brainer. We either need a dedicated local government boundaries commission, and I don't mean the old one that was killed off out of the 1960s Act, the key word in that's independent, or we need the Electoral Commission to set boundaries. The only arguments that are ever mounted against such a change are motivated by either innate conservatism or self-interest. So put those to one side, because we shouldn't take those into account. And I just ask you this, and it's a rhetorical question largely, but what possible coherent argument could be mounted against an independent body setting council boundaries in the public interest and based on a community of interest? In this day and age, that is not a radical proposition, my friends. Then we get to planning. Look, planning, you all know this, planning's no longer the sole province of local government, and we could actually stay in this room for years discussing why it's so. But I'd say this to you, anyone who has ever been through a complex planning process with any local government, knows how time-consuming, irrational, expensive and counterintuitive it is. There are always community groups opposed to change. That's how free societies work. At state and federal level, these issues are capable of being competently dealt with, and we know sometimes community agitators' views prevail. And when we look back, we go, that was good, but sometimes they don't. And then we sometimes look back at those and go, that was good, or whatever. But at every other level of government, those sort of issues get dealt with. But at the local level, community agitators target individual councillors. And the CCC made it plain that most of these councillors, not all of course, but most of these councillors operate with either no or poorly constructed policies and plans, and they're also poorly equipped and poorly trained to be able to handle the issue, let alone the confrontation. It gets very personal and messy. And what has happened at state level is, rather than deal with the fundamental causes of that planning dysfunction, the state's removed the control of planning from local government. And I've got to tell you, I find that unacceptable. There's some things you learn in life, but one of them is the drive for central planning usually comes from central planners. It also comes from bureaucrats. And more legitimately, it often comes from developers and businesses who operate across jurisdictions. But rigid central planning of the type we have almost always fails the public interest test. But it does serve the interests of those groups I mentioned earlier. And there's two bigger questions posed by that process. Why should the views and policies of an unelected and distant planner operating in private have more say in a planning matter than properly elected local government officials? The second one is that if a local government based on a community interest, or on a community of interest, is not allowed to plan in the interests of that local community, what actually is the point of local government? So to me, it's a fundamental. If the hills want to be clean and green and arty, who cares? Why shouldn't they be allowed to do that? If that's what the residents want and that's what the council wants and the council's based on those sort of interests, why the hell shouldn't they be allowed to do it? What's it got to do with the St George's Terrace planner? In most of your cases, in the western suburbs, if you want to be big blocked, leafy suburbs, what's the state interest? There really isn't one. If you're properly elected and you want to do those things, why the hell can't you? I don't see anything wrong with it. I live in a country town. We want to maintain our old worldly atmosphere and we don't want rubbish tips put on every second block. What's wrong with that? Why can't we do that? I just think it's a planning no-brainer. But the keys to doing that are you have to be properly elected and you have to be fairly elected, and the boundaries have to represent a community of interest. Otherwise, you're just a group of people in a room, to put it bluntly. I argue strongly that communities should be allowed to chart and be responsible for their own futures, but I also accept at times, and they are rare times, there is a state interest that will conflict with local planning. And the system should deal with that. But because planning is such an integral and central part of local government, planning should be part of this review process. How can you not talk about it in a review of local government? It's quite bizarre. We also have to accept that there were serious problems with local government and its planning processes, as we equally have to accept that there are serious problems with the inbuilt imbalance that there is built into the current processes. Both of these need to change, and I think the place to change them is in this review. Now I want to come on to one of the last points I want to make is about power. For local government to have any chance of becoming more relevant, the many inbuilt and debilitating power imbalances there are in the system have to be corrected. Planning's only one of them. The first, critical imbalances between the state and local government. The Constitution makes it crystal clear that local government is a creature of the state. The Act muddies the water. The current Act muddies the water. The ongoing departmental and ministerial desires to get away from the minutiae of local government has caused, I think, significant deterioration in the standard of regulation and oversight, and I think that has led to legislative micromanagement. But of all of the problems with power, this is the easiest one to fix. If state and local governments want to create a truly autonomous level of government, all they have to do is write it in the new Act. Boom, boom, job done. That's it. There better be a lot more public discussion about it beforehand, because I'm not convinced the public want it. I might be wrong, but my experience tells me that most people want more and not less state intervention in local government. Creating an autonomous level of government also means that ministerial approvals, the State Administrative Tribunal's role, the Planning Commission and the Planning Panel's powers will have to be removed or devolved, and that major change is possible, but it's very complicated, but it's not raised in any of the discussion papers to date. So it's not going to happen. Welga is a very healthy organisation that receives over $16 million a year in grants and from the provision of services. I assume all of this is taxpayer and ratepayers' money, but Welga doesn't report publicly. It employs 100 people and it has large cash reserves. Welga is so financially sound and mercenary, believe it or not, it made $475,133 last year, profit last year, from events, the local government convention and seminars. That's nearly $500,000. I argue that their legislated monopoly has made Welga so rich and powerful that they're dangerous. To fix that's easy. You just remove one schedule of the Act, it's gone, and Welga just goes off and be an association doing its own thing. It's a piece of cake. But I can tell you now, if you want to change this relationship, and I'm speaking particularly to a lot of my political friends here, you have to give some political cover. And I strongly recommend that you all do that. Regardless of your political views, there's a minister in power, the party he's in is irrelevant, and if you want him to change stuff, you don't get him to change stuff by making him the target. It's a serious power imbalance, that between Welga and the rest of the sector. It's dangerous in my view. Then there's the CEO issue, and I won't go any further because we touched on it before, other than to say the problem wasn't anticipated. There were some changes anticipated, but the extent and the where it's gone was not anticipated. And that system also is so far out of balance that, in my view, unless it's corrected, very few of the other proposed reforms are likely to be successful. It's a huge issue and it has to be corrected. There are many solutions to any given problem. In politics, you grow up with it's black and white, it's them or us. It isn't like that, we all know that. To any given problem, there are literally millions of solutions. But I'll be submitting to the review again that the elected versus admin conflict is deeply ingrained. The complaints systems in local government are so convoluted and the processes for the public to deal with issues are so disparate that what is required are fundamental changes to the electoral processes and boundary changes, a redefining of the roles of CEOs, councils and elected members, the removal of the legislated monopoly of Welga and a clarification of its role, either legislatively splitting the department into a general administrative department and a dedicated regulator, and understand that's already done administratively, but I'm talking legislatively, or the creation of an independent ombudsman to deal with all matters local government that aren't CCC matters. Some of you will be quite cynical and ask me a very valid question of where's the detail to support my propositions. Well, I'm not going to give you that and I'm not going to do that, and I will not be writing detailed papers for this reason. I'm lazy. No, apart from that, our system works on having a very good public service, and we do have a very good public service. And what they're outstandingly good at is once the direction is set, they are the people who come along and provide the detail, and they do it wonderfully well. My submissions are about trying to set a better direction. The directions I've proposed, I very humbly say, are more likely to improve our system of local government than anything else that's been produced by this review process to date. My final submission to the process will be completed shortly in the next week or so, and I'm more than happy to circulate that to anyone who's interested. But there is still the aberration of the review of the club by the club, and that should change. And I reiterate that we should be making a concerted push to be represented on it, as we should be pushing for the entire project to be referred to a parliamentary committee. If the Minister was to agree, the current process could end as soon as he made that referral. It's his decision. He's the only person who can make it. If it's not acceptable to him now, I can accept that also, because he started a process. He may well want to see how that goes and how it ends up. So it's not I'm dogmatic, you've got to get it here. But when that happens and the legislation goes into Parliament, it then should be reviewed off to a committee of the Legislative Assembly or a joint House committee to be examined in detail so that people can put genuine public input before the people who are going to write the Act. I wish you well, and I genuinely hope that you treat all of this review process with the gravitas it deserves. You can, of course, ignore all I've put forward and choose your own path. We do live in a democracy. I hope you don't. But I really do strongly recommend to you that you think carefully about where you want local government to be in the next 20 or 30 years, because this review is the only opportunity you're going to get in the rest of your life to put it there. In closing, I pass on my thanks and congratulations to Mayor Kerry Shannon and the town of Cambridge for taking what I consider to be an important initiative. I thank you, Kerry, for the invitation to address you today, and I thank you all for your attendance and your attention. Thank you. There are concerns about those things with Walga. There are concerns about I have concerns about its power and influence. There are concerns about it receiving public money and not reporting money. There are serious concerns about its preferred tendering processes. But more importantly than all of those is that Walga has usurped the role of the department as the source of regulatory advice for people in local government. There are literally thousands of people, no, hundreds probably, because there's only 1,500 odd, but there are large lumps of elected representatives who do not know that Walga is not the regulating authority. You then have, and I raised this in my submission, in the coming submission, you then have what I call the incestuous relationship, where executives from the department sit on the board of Walga, executives from the board of Walga sit on the department of the local professional officers association, and they are interlocked. Now, there's nothing wrong with those sorts of things in the normal course of events, except when you are the regulator. And Kenneth Hayne, and I'm glad you, because I draw on him heavily, Kenneth Hayne pointed out the only reason to have laws is that people have to obey them, and if there's no penalty for not obeying them, people will usually ignore them. And that's what's wrong with Walga. This is the only opportunity you will get for the next 30 years. Okay, so if you do not do it through this review and get it adequately addressed through this review, it is not going to change. I chose my words quite deliberately when I said power imbalance. There is no separation of powers. That's a myth. I've been around a bit, and I can tell you I've worked for people and I've had people work for me. I haven't had too many places where the bloke I've worked for, I've said to him, you can't do that and you've got to do what I tell you, and got away with it. I've tried it, but I've never got away with it. And any system that produces that is not a healthy system. But look, you do have rights, you do have powers, you do have authority, even under the current Act. But the problem is that the system is designed for you to be able to exercise your authority. You need information, and the person who controls the information is the person that you want to have oversight to. It's fundamentally flawed.
Government Act against the CEO for giving telling you
Yep.
misinformation.
Yep. And look, there is no comparable position in the public service in Australia anywhere else. If any departmental CEO acted like that to their minister, they'd be booted in 5 minutes. In the corporate world, if any CEO acted towards a board like that, they'd be gone before the meeting closed. It's unique.
You can't blame the CEO who might have 30 years' experience.
Yep.
The councillor comes on board.
Yep.
With some limited experience,
Yep.
probably in management, but certainly, you know, the balance there is the imbalance there.
Look, the fundamental of democracy is that we elect generalists to oversee specialists. And what makes that work is the specialists have to be prepared to give advice and the generalists have to be prepared to accept it. If either one of those is missing, it just doesn't work. I head the 2J Progress Association. That was an organisation started with all the right intentions, with all the right people, to try and help a council that was moribund, I guess is the word I'd use. And what we tried to do was work with them, and instead they chose to have a fight, which is a bit unfortunate but not uncommon. The department has announced an inquiry into the Shire of 2J, about which we are absolutely ecstatic. That is the culmination of 2.5 years' work by about a dozen people. And that's the answer in a nutshell. You have to do the work. You have to get the detail, as boring and as terrible as that is. You have to do that. You have to find the evidence and you have to produce the evidence, and you have to cop all that comes back from that. And even having spent most of my adult life in public life, I can tell you it's very unpleasant. It isn't easy. Now, put that to one side, because that's how the process worked for us. You go look through the complaints processes for local government. Before a citizen can make a complaint, they have to know which part of the Act has been breached. They have to know whether it's a minor, a major or a corrupt act, and they have to understand the detail of the system to know who to put it into. It is as if the complaints system in local government is designed to prevent complaints coming forward. There's nothing else like it anywhere else in the nation. It is bizarre, right? And that's where I'm saying, if we want to fix those things, the place to fix it is in this review.